My brother and I were inseparable growing up, and then one conversation, when we were both adults, revealed that we had completely different memories of the same childhood, and neither of us has been quite sure what to do with that ever since. I need to tell you something about my brother before I tell you anything else. His name is Ryan, and he is 14 months older than me, which in practical terms meant that for most of our childhood we were effectively the same age. Same school at the same time, same friend groups overlapping at the edges, same house, same parents, same Saturday mornings and summer vacations and holiday dinners. We were not just brothers in the biological sense, we were each other's primary witness. The person who was there for all of it, who shared the same rooms and the same years, and the same version of everything that happened. That is what I believed for the first 28 years of my life, that we had shared the same version of everything, that our memories of growing up, whatever their individual differences in detail, were fundamentally oriented around the same basic reality, the same house, the same parents, the same childhood. I was wrong about that in a way I did not begin to understand until one specific conversation on a Tuesday evening in November, when Ryan and I were both in our late 20s, sitting at a kitchen table after dinner in the apartment he shared with his girlfriend, and something he said stopped me so completely that I had to ask him to repeat it because I thought I had misheard. I had not misheard. But I need to back up to tell this properly, because the conversation did not come from nowhere, and the context matters more than the conversation itself in some ways. The context is the full story of what our childhood actually was from the inside of it, or at least what the inside of it was from my side, which is the only side I have full access to. And describing that honestly requires me to describe our family, which I am going to do as accurately as I can while being fair to everyone involved. Our parents were together for the entirety of our childhood and remain together now. They have been married for 37 years. By most external measures, the family we grew up in was stable and functional. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. We lived in the same house from the time I was 4 until the time I left for college. Our parents were present. There was no addiction, no serious financial crisis, no dramatic rupture that I could point to as the defining difficulty of the years we grew up in. What there was instead was something quieter and more pervasive, something that does not have a clean category name, and that I spent many years struggling to articulate, because articulating it required me to say something critical about people I loved without the supporting evidence of a clear identifiable wrong that had been committed. What there was in our house was a persistent and low-grade emotional atmosphere that I can only describe as pressurized, not dangerous, not cruel. Just consistently pressurized, in the way that a room with the windows never opened develops a particular quality of air after a while. You stop noticing it because it's all you know, but it's there. My father is a man who loves his family genuinely and completely, and who also has very specific ideas about what that love requires of the people he loves in return. He needs things done in particular ways. He has a threshold for disorder, both physical and emotional, that is low, and when that threshold is crossed, the atmosphere in the house changes in a way that everyone can feel even when nothing is explicitly said. He is not a shouting man. That is important to understand. The pressure in our house was never expressed through volume, or through any behavior that would have been clearly identifiable as problematic to an outside observer. It was expressed through silence, through a particular quality of withdrawal that was more frightening than anger would have been, through the consistent low-level communication that peace in the house was contingent on certain conditions being met. My mother loved us and still loves us and spent most of our childhood in the role of translator and buffer, the person who read the atmospheric pressure and adjusted everyone's behavior accordingly, who knew before anyone else when the threshold was approaching and who quietly worked to prevent the crossing of it. She was good at this. She had been doing it for as long as I had been alive and probably longer. She did it without apparent resentment and without ever naming it as a role she was playing. It was simply how the household functioned, and she was the mechanism by which it functioned. I absorbed all of this the way children absorb the atmospheres they grow up in, completely and without conscious analysis. I did not think of our household as having a particular atmosphere. It was just home. The pressure was normal because it was the only normal I had ever known. I was a careful child, attentive to mood in the specific way of children who grow up in houses where mood matters, quick to read the room and adjust, good at being whatever the moment seemed to require. I was told frequently by adults outside the family that I was mature for my age. Looking back, I understand that the maturity they were observing was a learned skill rather than a natural trait, a byproduct of years of practiced attentiveness to the emotional state of the people around me. Ryan was different in this regard, not completely different. He had grown up in the same house and had the same baseline attentiveness, but he was more openly himself than I was, more willing to take up space, more likely to push against the edges of what the atmosphere permitted and absorb the consequences. He was louder, more physical, more likely to argue back when something felt unfair rather than to absorb it silently and adjust. He got into more trouble than I did, not because he was worse, but because he was less comprehensively self-regulating. This difference between us produced different relationships with our father, and those different relationships are part of the context I need to give you before the Tuesday conversation makes full sense. My father understood Ryan better than he understood me, I think, or at least was more comfortable with the kind of person Ryan was. Ryan's directness, even when it led to friction, was a quality my father recognized and respected on some level. They clashed, but they also had a directness of connection that my relationship with my father lacked. My father and I were close in a different, and in some ways more careful way, the way you are close with someone when both of you are being precise about what you show each other, when both of you have learned, through long experience, where the edges are. I was, to put it plainly, my mother's child in the way that Ryan was my father's, not exclusively, not in some dramatic Oedipal sense, just in terms of the particular quality of understanding that existed in those two dyads versus the other two. My mother and I understood each other in ways that did not require much translation. My father and Ryan understood each other in ways that did not require much translation. The cross-connections, my father and me, my mother and Ryan, were loving but required more work. None of this was spoken about in our family. It was simply the architecture of the relationships, present and operating, and never examined. We were a family that did not do a great deal of explicit examination of itself. Feelings were acknowledged when they were large enough to be impossible to ignore and otherwise moved past efficiently. We had warmth and we had humor, and we had the genuine love that I think was always the foundation, and those things were real and are real, and I want to be clear about that. But we did not talk about the texture of things. We did not have the language or the habit for it. I left for college at 18 and Ryan had left the year before. The leaving was, for me, a physical experience of relief that I did not immediately understand. I remember the drive away from the house with my parents having dropped me off, sitting in my new dormitory room for the first time, and feeling something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. I attributed it at the time to excitement about the new beginning rather than to anything about what I was leaving. That is a more comfortable story, and it took several years before I revised it. In college and through my early 20s, I was what anyone looking at me from the outside would have described as fine. I made friends, did well academically, had relationships. I was not unhappy, but I had a persistent quality of over-attentiveness in my relationships that I could feel but not explain. A constant low-level monitoring of other people's moods, and an instinctive adjustment of my own behavior in response to what I read, that was exhausting in a way I was not fully aware of, because it was so habitual as to feel like simply how interaction worked. Ryan and I stayed close through our 20s in the way of siblings who genuinely like each other and whose connection has survived the dispersal of leaving home. We talked regularly. We visited. We had the shorthand of people who grew up together, the references and the shared history, and the ability to communicate in fragments that only work when two people have the same baseline. I thought I knew him completely, in the same way I had once thought Nora knew me completely, and I mean that parallel deliberately because the conversation that is coming has a similar structure to the birthday conversation I described in another context, the sudden revelation of a gap between what I had assumed and what was actually true. The Tuesday in November when everything shifted was not a dramatic evening. Ryan and his girlfriend had made dinner and I had come over after work, and we had eaten and the girlfriend had gone to bed early because she had an early morning, and Ryan and I had stayed at the table the way we did when it was just us, talking without any particular agenda, the conversation moving through its usual range. At some point we started talking about home, not in any loaded way, just the way people talk about where they grew up when they are adult enough to have some distance on it. We had talked about home before, across the years, and it had never produced anything unexpected. But this time something in the conversation went further than it usually did, past the surface anecdotes and into something more reflective, and I said something about our father, about the particular quality of the atmosphere in the house growing up, the pressure I described earlier, and I said it in the way I had learned over the years to say honest things about my family, carefully, moderately, leaving plenty of room for the other person to disagree or to see it differently. Ryan looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "I didn't feel that." I thought I had misheard him. I asked him to say it again. He said, "The pressure thing you're describing, I didn't feel that, I don't remember it that way at all." I sat with that for a moment. I had been describing something that had been, for me, the defining atmospheric quality of our shared childhood, the central invisible fact of growing up in that house. And my brother, who had grown up in the same house, in the same years, with the same parents, was telling me he had not experienced it. Not that he remembered it differently, not that his version was softer than mine or harder than mine, that he had not felt it at all. I asked him what he did remember. He said he remembered a house that was sometimes tense, sure, because all houses were sometimes tense, but basically warm and functional. He said he remembered a father who was demanding but fair, who had high standards but whose standards he had always understood and been able to meet without too much difficulty. He said he remembered our mother as calm and steady rather than as someone who was managing the atmosphere. He said it had been a normal, pretty good childhood. I listened to all of that, and then I said, as carefully as I could, that what he was describing was genuinely not what I had experienced. That the childhood I was describing, the pressurized atmosphere, the careful management, the attentiveness I had developed as a survival skill, was the childhood I had actually lived in that house. He looked at me with an expression that I had never seen on his face before, which was a kind of genuine uncertainty, not defensiveness, not dismissal, actual uncertainty. like I had introduced a fact that did not fit the framework he was working with, and he was not sure what to do with it. He said, "I believe you," and then after a pause he said, "I just don't understand how we grew up in the same house." That question, how two people grew up in the same house and emerged with such fundamentally different experiences of it, is the question that this story is really about. It is the question Ryan and I have been sitting with ever since that Tuesday in November in the 2 years since, and I want to try to answer it as honestly as I can, with the caveat that any answer I give is necessarily partial and incomplete, because the full answer involves two interior lives that can only be partially accessed from the outside, even by the two people who lived them. The first and most obvious part of the answer is the difference I described earlier between us, the difference in how each of us had related to our father. Ryan had had a directness of connection with our father that I had not had. Where I had been precise and careful, he had been more openly himself. And because he was more openly himself in a way that our father could recognize and relate to, the atmosphere I described as pressurized had been, for Ryan, simply the normal texture of a relationship with a demanding father. He had pushed against it and absorbed the friction, and it had not produced in him the same hypervigilance that it had produced in me, because for him the friction was comprehensible and navigable rather than opaque and unpredictable. The pressure had been real for both of us, but it had landed differently. On me, because of the specific nature of my relationship with our father and my particular sensitivity to that kind of atmospheric signal, it had accumulated into something formative. On Ryan, because of his different relationship with the same man and his different way of being in the world, it had registered and passed through without the same accumulation. We had grown up in the same house and in different houses simultaneously. That is the answer, or the beginning of it. The second part of the answer is about our mother and our different relationships with her. Because I was the child who was more attuned to the atmosphere, I had also been the child who was more aware of my mother's role within it. I had watched her manage and translate and buffer in ways that Ryan had not been watching. He had experienced her as calm and steady, which she was, but without the undertone of labor that I had perceived beneath the calm. He had not seen what I had seen because he had not been looking for the same things. Children look for what they need, and what I needed, growing up, was to understand the emotional mechanics of the household I was living in. Ryan had not needed to understand those mechanics in the same way, and so he had not been watching for them. The third part of the answer, the one that took me the longest to arrive at, and that is still the most uncomfortable, is about the role I had been playing in the family, and whether that role itself had shaped my experience of the childhood in ways that went beyond what I had already described. I had been in our family the child who absorbed the atmosphere, not consciously, not as a choice, but functionally. My attentiveness and my careful self-regulation had served a purpose in the household, had contributed to the management of the atmospheric pressure by making me a source of very little friction. And in serving that purpose I had also been, in a way that I had not understood until I started thinking about it in the aftermath of the Tuesday conversation, carrying something on behalf of the family that Ryan had not been carrying, something about the weight of the unspoken, the pressure of what was felt but never named. I had been the family's emotional absorber, the same way my mother had been the family's atmospheric manager, and we had both been doing it without ever naming it as a role or examining what it cost. Ryan had not been doing it, not because he was less caring or less invested in the family, but because the role had not been assigned to him, and he had not assigned it to himself, and so he had moved through the same childhood with significantly less of that specific weight. That realization, when it arrived, was one of the more disorienting ones of the whole conversation's aftermath, because it meant that the childhood I had experienced, the pressurized one, the one requiring constant attentiveness and careful management of myself, had been partly a product of the role I was playing within the family system, rather than simply a direct reflection of external conditions. The external conditions had been real, the pressure had been real. But I had been amplifying and absorbing it in ways that were specific to my position in the family, and Ryan, in a different position, had been experiencing the same conditions through a fundamentally different filter. We talked for a long time that Tuesday, long past when we had planned to stop. Well into the kind of late-night territory, where the conversation has moved beyond the comfortable and into the genuinely excavating, where you say things you have not said before because the hour has made them possible. We were both careful with each other, the way you are careful when the territory is unfamiliar and you are not sure where the edges are. But we were also honest in ways that we had not been in all the years before, honest about our individual experiences of the family we had shared, about the gaps between those experiences, about what those gaps said about each of us and about the family itself. Ryan said something near the end of the conversation that I have thought about many times since. He said, "I think I had it easier and I didn't know it." He said it with a genuine quality of reckoning, not guilt exactly, but the particular feeling of understanding something about your own privilege within a system in a way that cannot be unfelt. He had not known that I had been carrying something he had not been carrying. He had assumed, as I had assumed, that we had been experiencing the same childhood in roughly equivalent ways. The assumption had turned out to be wrong in a direction that revealed an asymmetry he had not previously been aware of. I told him I didn't think it was about easier or harder exactly. I told him I thought it was about different positions producing different experiences, and that neither of us had chosen our positions. He had not chosen to have a more natural connection with our father any more than I had chosen to be the family's emotional absorber. We had both been shaped by the system we grew up in, and the system had shaped us differently based on where we each stood within it. He said he understood that intellectually and that it didn't quite remove the discomfort of knowing that while I had been carrying something, he had not known there was anything to carry. I said I understood the discomfort and that I didn't need him to fix it retroactively, because there was nothing to fix retroactively. The past was the past, and we were both just trying to understand it more accurately than we had before. We did not resolve everything that night. You cannot resolve 28 years of differing memory in a single kitchen table conversation, regardless of how honest you both are trying to be. What we did was open something that had been closed, not because it had been deliberately shut, but because we had both assumed the opening was unnecessary, had both assumed that the shared childhood was shared in a way that turned out not to be entirely accurate. The opening was uncomfortable in the days that followed. I went home that night and lay awake for a long time thinking about what Ryan had said, and what I had said, and what it all meant for how I understood my own history. Some of the discomfort was about the obvious thing, the strangeness of discovering that the person who had been your primary witness for the first 18 years of your life had been witnessing something different. But some of it was about something less obvious, which was the question of what it meant for my current relationship with my parents. The question of what the Tuesday conversation meant for my relationship with my parents was one I circled around for weeks before I was ready to approach it directly. Not because I was avoiding it exactly, more because I needed to understand what I actually thought before I could do anything useful with the thinking. I had spent most of my adult life operating within a particular framework about my parents and my childhood, a framework that acknowledged the difficulty of certain aspects of growing up in that house, while also maintaining a kind of careful equilibrium about it, a managed distance from the full weight of what I had actually experienced. That framework had been functional. It had allowed me to have a loving adult relationship with both of my parents, to show up for family dinners and holidays, and the ordinary ongoing life of a family, without the unprocessed material of the childhood constantly disrupting the present. What the Tuesday conversation had done was introduce a crack into that framework, not by adding new information exactly. Everything Ryan and I had talked about had been, in some form, available to me before, but hearing my own experience reflected back as something Ryan had not shared, having it confirmed as specifically mine rather than as a general condition of the household that everyone had lived with equally, made it harder to maintain the managed distance I had been maintaining. It became more real when it became more particular. The pressure I had grown up in had been mine in a way I had not fully reckoned with, and the reckoning, once started, was not easy to stop. I called my mother about 3 weeks after the conversation with Ryan, not to have a confrontation. I want to be clear about that because confrontation was the thing I had spent 30 years being precisely structured to avoid, and the 30-year habit did not dissolve in 3 weeks. I called her in the way I usually called her, the ordinary Tuesday or Wednesday evening call that had been part of our routine since I moved out, and at some point in the conversation, I steered it carefully toward the territory I needed to cover. I told her that Ryan and I had been talking about the family and about growing up, and that the conversation had made me want to ask her something. She said of course, in the particular way she had of saying of course that communicated full attention. I asked her if she had been aware, when Ryan and I were growing up, that the two of us were having different experiences of the household. There was a pause, not a long one, but noticeable. She said, "I think I always knew you were more sensitive to things than Ryan was." I sat with that word, sensitive. It is a word I had heard applied to myself throughout my childhood, used by adults as both a description, and occasionally, a gentle explanation for why I seemed to feel things more acutely than my brother did, why I needed more careful handling in certain situations. I had internalized it as a characteristic of myself, a trait like eye color or left-handedness, something I was simply born with that accounted for the differences in how I moved through the world compared to Ryan. I said to my mother, gently, that I wasn't sure sensitivity was the complete explanation, that I thought I might have been playing a role in the family that had shaped my experience in ways that went beyond my natural temperament, that I thought some of what I had always attributed to being more sensitive than Ryan might have been more about my position in the family system and what that position had required of me. Another pause, longer this time. She said, "I think that's probably true." And then she said something that I had not expected and that I want to reproduce as accurately as I can because it mattered. She said that she was sorry that I had felt the weight of things that she had been managing herself, and that she had not meant for that weight to be transferred, but that she could see, looking back, how it might have been. I did not cry on that phone call, but I wanted to, which is different from crying and in some ways more telling. The apology was small and careful and not comprehensive, and it was also the first time in my life that my mother had said anything to me that acknowledged the specific role I had been playing in the family, the absorbing of the atmosphere, and named it as something I should not have had to carry alone. It did not resolve anything in any structural sense. One careful phone call does not undo 30 years of a particular dynamic, but it moved something. The acknowledgement moved something, in the way that being seen moves something even when the seeing is partial and late. I want to talk about my father because I have been describing him throughout this story in a way that is honest, but that I am aware risks being one-dimensional. And I don't want to leave him one-dimensional because he is not one-dimensional, and the full story of the childhood and of what the Tuesday conversation required me to reckon with includes a more complete picture of him than I have given so far. My father grew up in a household that made our household look positively expressive. He is the oldest of 4 children raised by a man who communicated primarily through expectation and silence, who defined love through provision and never through articulation, who was not cruel but who was profoundly emotionally closed in ways that shaped everyone he raised. My father learned to be a person from that model, and while he has in many ways exceeded the model, has been more present than his father was, and has said "I love you" in a way his father never did, he is also, in ways he has never fully examined, his father's son. The pressure in our house was not a personality flaw or a failure of character. It was a transmission, something that had been passed to him before he had words for it, and that he had not been given the tools to interrupt. He did not know, growing up, that there was another way to be in a family. He learned what families felt like from the inside of one particular family, and that learning went deep enough that revising it as an adult would have required a kind of self-examination that he had never been invited to do, and that the culture he came from did not recognize as necessary. I understood this intellectually for most of my adult life. The intellectual understanding was part of the managed distance I mentioned earlier, the framework that allowed me to acknowledge the difficulty of the childhood while maintaining equilibrium in the present. What the Tuesday conversation did was make me feel it, actually feel it, in a way that the intellectual understanding had been successfully preventing. And feeling it was different from knowing it in the same way that actually walking through a place is different from looking at a map of it. Feeling it meant that I had to hold 2 things simultaneously that the managed distance framework had been allowing me to hold separately. The love was real. The damage was also real, not damage in a dramatic sense, not the kind of damage that generates treatment plans or trauma narratives. The quieter kind, the kind that expresses itself in a 30-year-old man who is exhaustingly good at reading the room and adjusting himself to it, who monitors the emotional temperature of every relationship he is in with an efficiency that was learned under conditions that required it, and that persists now in conditions that do not. I started therapy about 2 months after the Tuesday conversation, not because I was in crisis, more because the conversation had opened something that I did not have sufficient tools to process on my own, and I was honest enough with myself about that to seek out the tools rather than to wait for the opening to close over again. The therapist I found, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Owens, had a particular quality that I recognized from the first session as useful, which was that she received everything I told her without any visible reaction that might require me to manage. She was the first person in a professional context whose emotional response I genuinely did not monitor during our conversations, and the relief of that was immediate and somewhat astonishing. In the early sessions, I told her about the childhood and about the Tuesday conversation and about what it had produced in me. She listened, and then she asked me a question that became, over the following months, the central question of what I was working on. She asked me what I thought I would be like as a person if I had grown up not needing to monitor the atmosphere. I did not have an answer to that question in the first session. I sat with it for a long time. What I eventually arrived at, over several sessions and several weeks of thinking between sessions, was not a complete answer but a direction. I thought I would have been more spacious. That is the word I kept coming back to. Not happier exactly, not more successful or more functional in any measurable way, but more spacious, with more interior room, less occupied by the constant background process of reading and adjusting. I thought the attention that had been allocated to monitoring would have been available for other things, for being more present in the moment rather than perpetually slightly ahead of it, for asking what I actually wanted rather than what the situation seemed to require. Dr. Owens said that was a useful observation, and then she asked me whether I thought it was too late for any of that, whether the spaciousness was something that could be developed now in my late 20s, or whether it was something that only childhood could have provided. I said I genuinely didn't know. She said that was probably the right answer and that finding out was what the work was. The work, as it turned out, was slow. Not disappointing slow, just the speed at which real interior change actually happens, which is different from the speed of insight, the 2 things operating on very different timelines. I could have the insight in a session and then spend months learning how to change the behavior that the insight revealed, the monitoring, the adjusting, the constant reading of the room, habits so deeply grooved that they operated below the level of conscious choice in most situations. I started noticing things I had not noticed before, or rather started catching things I had always done without seeing them as choices. The way I would soften an opinion before expressing it, pre-adjusting for the imagined reaction before the reaction had occurred. The way I would check the emotional temperature of a room as soon as I entered it, before I had said a word to anyone. The way I would track multiple conversations simultaneously in social settings, monitoring the overall mood of a gathering, in addition to participating in my own portion of it. These were things I had always done. They had never felt like choices because they had never been choices. They had been automatic responses, shaped by years of living in an environment that required them. Learning to see them as things I was doing, rather than as simply how I was the first step toward being able to do them differently. Ryan and I talked several more times in the months after the Tuesday conversation. Not always about the family. Sometimes just in the ordinary way, the regular phone calls and the visits, the shorthand and the shared history. But when we did talk about the family, the conversations were different from how they had been before, more honest and less automatically conciliatory, both of us willing to stay in the uncomfortable territory longer rather than moving past it quickly. He asked me once, about 4 months after the Tuesday conversation, whether I was angry at our parents. It was a direct question, and he asked it directly, in the manner that was characteristic of him, the manner I had always recognized as a quality he had that I had always wished I had more of. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said I didn't think angry was quite the right word. I said I thought angry implied a clarity about fault and intent that the situation didn't quite support, because what I had experienced in the childhood had not been the product of malice or even conscious neglect. It had been the product of a system, of patterns transmitted across generations, of people doing what they knew how to do and passing on what had been passed to them. I said what I felt was closer to grief, which was the grief of understanding something about your own childhood more fully and accurately than you had before and having to absorb the cost of that understanding. Ryan said he thought he felt something similar, even though his experience had been different, and I asked him what he meant. He said that understanding the childhood more fully had required him to revise the story he had been telling himself about it, and that the revision came with its own losses. The story he had been telling himself was that it had been a basically good childhood for both of us, and learning that it had not been a basically good childhood for me in the ways it had been for him required him to give up a version of our shared history that he had found genuinely comforting. He was grieving the loss of that version, while I was grieving the direct experience that had made the version inaccurate. That is one of the most honest things Ryan has ever said to me, and I appreciated it more than I told him at the time, though I think he knew. There was a family dinner in the spring, about 5 months after the Tuesday conversation, the kind of regular holiday gathering that our family had always done. Both Ryan and I were there with our respective partners, our parents at the head of the table, the familiar rituals of the meal playing out in their usual sequence. On the surface, it looked exactly as it always had. The same house, the same table, the same food, the same family. But I was in it differently than I had ever been before. Not visibly differently, I don't think. I was not cold or withdrawn or performing any visible change in how I was showing up. But inside the familiar scene, I was present in a new way, less automatically monitoring and adjusting, more actually there, more occupying my own position rather than the position the room seemed to require. At one point during the dinner, my father made a comment, the kind of mild offhand comment that in the old framework I would have tracked as an atmospheric signal and adjusted my behavior in response to without ever consciously registering the adjustment. And I noticed it happening. I noticed myself beginning the adjustment, and I noticed for the first time that I was doing it. The monitoring was still there, the habit was still running, but it was visible to me now in a way it had not been before, and that visibility, even without any accompanying change in behavior, felt like a significant thing. I looked across the table at Ryan and found him looking at me, not significantly, just the ordinary eye contact of two people at a family dinner, but there was something in it that I read as recognition, the particular recognition of two people who have looked at the same thing from different angles and have, through conversation, come to understand both angles more completely. I did not say anything, and neither did he. The dinner continued. The evening continued. But something was different in the room that had always been the most familiar room in my life, and I felt it in a way that was not painful exactly, more like the feeling of adjusting to a new prescription, the world coming into a slightly different and more accurate focus than it had held before. The family was the same. I was not quite the same inside it, and I was still in the process of understanding what that meant and what it would produce over time. The Tuesday conversation had not fixed anything in the clean way that conversations are sometimes imagined to fix things. It had started a process that I was still inside of, a long, slow adjustment of the relationship between myself and my own history, between the story I had been telling about the childhood and the more complete and complicated story that the honesty of that Tuesday kitchen table had made necessary. Ryan called me the following week after the dinner. He asked how I had been. I said fine in the way that was different from the old way of saying fine, the way that meant something closer to I am in the middle of something, and it is going as well as it can be expected to go. He said he knew. He said he had been thinking about the dinner too. He said it was strange to sit at that table now after everything, and feel the thing you were describing, and not be able to say anything about it to the people at the other end of the table. I said yes, I said that was exactly it. The knowing that could not be said, not because it was secret, but because there was no language for it in that room, no established vocabulary or habit of conversation that would have allowed the saying, without requiring a complete restructuring of the entire dinner. Some things are true and unspoken simultaneously, not because anyone has decided to keep them that way, but because the container does not yet exist for their speaking. We were building a new container. That was what the months after the Tuesday conversation were. Ryan and I, together and individually, building the container that our family had never provided, the space in which the honest version of the history could be held and examined, and carried without requiring it to be performed or resolved or converted into something more manageable. It was slow work. It was also, I thought, some of the most important work I had ever done. There is a particular challenge that comes with doing the kind of interior work I have been describing, while simultaneously maintaining an ongoing relationship with the people and the family system that the work is about. It is not the challenge of confrontation, which is the one most people imagine when they hear about someone reckoning with their family history. It is subtler than that. It is the challenge of remaining present and loving in a relationship while also, in a private interior space that runs parallel to the relationship, seeing that relationship more clearly and honestly than you have seen it before. Holding both simultaneously, without allowing the clearer seeing to turn into a withdrawal, and without allowing the desire to remain present to pressure you back into the old unseen version. I want to describe what that challenge looked like in practical terms across the year, following the Tuesday conversation, because I think the practical texture of it is more honest and more useful than a general description of the emotional landscape. My parents called, as they always had, on a weekly cycle. My mother on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, my father less regularly but reliably on Sundays, usually in the early afternoon. These calls had been part of the rhythm of my adult life since college, and I had never examined them much, had simply received them as the ongoing maintenance of connection that adult children perform with their parents as a matter of course. After the Tuesday conversation, I started paying different attention to those calls, not in a suspicious or investigative way, but in the way of someone who has been given a new lens and cannot help seeing through it. What I noticed, paying different attention to the calls with my mother, was the degree to which she reported on the family. Not gossip exactly, more a kind of ongoing account of the household and its dynamics, delivered in the careful modulated way she had always communicated, which was honest about facts and careful about feelings. She would tell me what my father had been working on that week, what his mood had been like, what had been good and what had been difficult. She had always done this, and I had always received it as simply how she talked about her life, which was largely continuous with her life with him. But I started hearing, in the Tuesday conversation's aftermath, the management in it. The way the reporting was not just information sharing, but a kind of ongoing translation, a continued performance of the role she had been playing for decades, rendering the household's interior life into a form that her children could receive without having to encounter it raw. I felt hearing it through the new lens, a complicated mixture of things: love for her, which was constant and real, sadness for the decades of labor the translation represented, and a kind of careful anger, not hot anger, the banked kind, at the situation that had made the translation necessary and kept making it necessary even now when Ryan and I were adults with our own lives, and neither of us required the buffering in the way we had as children. I did not say any of this to her on the Tuesday or Wednesday calls, not yet. I was still in the middle of understanding it, and I had learned, through the therapy and through the particular kind of attention that the post-Tuesday period had produced in me, that namming things before you fully understand them tends to produce conversations that resolve in the wrong direction, that the urgency of the feeling pushes you toward a version of the conversation that is about the feeling rather than about the thing the feeling is pointing to. The calls with my father were different in quality. They had always been more transactional than emotional, which is not a criticism of him, but an accurate description of how he communicated, the calls tending to cover the practical and the factual, and to move efficiently rather than to linger. He would ask about work and about the logistics of my life, and occasionally about Ryan, and I would ask him about his projects and his week, and the whole thing would be warm in a functional and somewhat contained way, and then we would both say goodbye with genuine affection and hang up, and that would be the Sunday call. I noticed, paying different attention to those calls, how much of the warmth in them I was generating, not performing. The warmth was genuine, but I was the one who asked follow-up questions and who remembered what he had mentioned the previous Sunday and who circled back to things in a way that created the feeling of continuity in the relationship. He received all of that and responded to it with the warmth he was capable of, which was real and not nothing. But the labor of connection was mine, in a way that I had never consciously registered, because I had been doing it for so long that it had the quality of natural behavior rather than effort. That observation did not make me angry at him. It made me understand something about the specific shape of what I had been carrying, which was not just the atmospheric attentiveness of the childhood, but a continued version of it in adult form, the ongoing management of a relationship with someone I loved, who did not have the same tools for managing it that I had developed. The role had not ended when I left the house. I had simply taken it with me and continued performing it at a distance of phone calls and visits. I talked about all of this with Dr. Owens across multiple sessions through the winter and spring. The sessions had developed a particular rhythm by that point, the early part covering whatever had been happening in the preceding weeks, the middle going deeper into whatever the early part had surfaced, and the end doing the thing that I found most useful, which was locating the theme that was running through everything. Dr. Owens was good at finding themes. She had a way of holding a lot of disparate information, and then namming the thread that ran through it, not in a reductive way, but in the way of someone who had been genuinely listening and could reflect back the shape of what had been said. The theme she identified in the winter sessions, which I had been circling around without quite namming, was about the relationship between the role I had been playing and my sense of identity. She said, at some point in February, that it sounded like the role of family absorber had been so continuous and so foundational to my experience of myself that it was genuinely difficult to locate who I was independent of it. That the monitoring and the adjusting had not just been behaviors I performed but had become, over decades, part of how I understood myself as a person. I was the careful one, the attentive one, the one who knew what the room required. That had been my identity in the family, and to a significant extent in my relationships outside it. She asked what I was afraid would happen if I stopped being that person. The question sat in the room for a long time. I said eventually that I was afraid there would be less there, that the monitoring and the adjusting had taken up enough interior space, that removing them might reveal something that was smaller or less formed than I had assumed, that the careful attentive identity was, in some way I found difficult to look at directly, the structural thing holding everything else up, and that without it I did not know what the shape of myself actually was. She said that was a very honest answer. She said it was also very common in people who had developed that particular role in childhood. She said the fear of the emptiness underneath, the role was one of the main things that kept people in the role long past the conditions that had made it necessary, because the role, however exhausting, was at least a known quantity, while the self underneath it was an unknown. I spent a lot of time with that in the weeks that followed, the unknown self underneath the role. I tried to find it in small ways, in moments when I noticed the monitoring beginning and tried, experimentally, to let it run without acting on it, to let the atmospheric reading happen and then not adjust myself in response, to stay where I was instead of repositioning. It felt at first like doing nothing, which was uncomfortable in a very specific way, the discomfort of a habit interrupted rather than the discomfort of genuine difficulty. But underneath the surface discomfort, in the space where the adjusting was not happening, something was there. Quieter and less articulate than the monitoring had always been, more tentative, but present. Some quality of my own that had been consistently below the threshold of the monitoring's noise. Ryan came to visit in March, about 4 months after the Tuesday conversation, and stayed for a long weekend. It was the first extended time we had spent together since the conversation, and I was curious, in the anticipatory way of someone who has changed, and is not sure whether the change will be visible to someone who knew them before it, what the visit would feel like. It felt different, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to an observer, but different in the specific quality of how we were with each other, both of us having done several months of our individual versions of the same basic work, and both of us carrying more of what we had found into the room. We talked more honestly about our parents than we had in all the years before the Tuesday conversation combined, not more critically, more honestly, which is a different thing. We acknowledged the things that had been real about the childhood, both the genuine love and the specific difficulties, without the automatic move toward balance that we had always made before, the habit of quickly offsetting any critical observation with a compensating positive one, which is a thing that people do when they are being careful, and which looks like fairness but is sometimes just avoidance. We talked about our father with the specific mixture of love and clear-sightedness that I think is the only honest position available to people who had complicated experiences with parents they also genuinely love. We acknowledged what he had given us and what the limitations of what he could give had cost us, and we held both of those things in the same conversation without one cancelling the other out. Ryan said something that weekend that I want to include here because it was the thing that moved the most during those 3 days. He said that the Tuesday conversation had made him rethink some things about his own adult relationships, not just about the family. He said he had realized, thinking about the dynamic I had described, that he had his own version of something he had been carrying without knowing it, which was a kind of entitlement to ease in relationships, a low-level expectation that connection would come without the labor of sustained attention, that if the connection was genuine, it should not require the kind of deliberate work that I had clearly been doing in all my relationships without ever identifying it as work. He said he thought the ease had come from his position in the family, from being the one who had not had to perform the attentiveness, and that he had carried that ease out into his adult relationships in a way that he was not sure had always been fair to the people he had been in those relationships with. He said he thought some of what his girlfriend had occasionally described as him being emotionally unavailable might have roots in this, in the long habit of receiving connection without fully reciprocating the labor of it. I said I thought that was a genuinely honest observation and that it took something to make it. He said it was easier to make honest observations about himself now that he had a fuller picture of the family system, now that he understood what positions had been operating and what each position had produced. The honesty that the Tuesday conversation had made necessary for me had apparently made its own kind of honesty possible for him, just pointed in a different direction. That is one of the things I have come to value most about what the Tuesday conversation produced. It was not just a bilateral reckoning, just Ryan and me examining my experience of the childhood and his different experience of it. It became, over the months that followed, a mutual examination in which we each used the other's perspective as a kind of mirror that showed us things about ourselves that our own perspective alone could not have revealed. I could not have seen the specific shape of the role I had been playing without Ryan's account of not having played it. His account made mine visible in a way that my account alone could not, and he could not have seen the specific entitlement to ease that he had developed without my account of the labor that had been running beneath the ease. My account made his visible. We had grown up in the same house, and our different experiences of it turned out to be, for each of us, the key to understanding not just the childhood but ourselves. The summer that followed was the first summer of my adult life in which I went to my parents' house for a visit, and did not spend the entire visit in the low-grade monitoring state I had always been in there, not because I had resolved everything or arrived at some permanent equilibrium, but because I had enough of the work done by then that I could be in that house with more of myself present, could feel the old atmospheric signals and not automatically reconfigure myself in response, could sit at the table with my father and experience the particular quality of his presence without it triggering the full activation of the childhood's learned response. It was not a transformed visit. The house was the same. My parents were the same. The dynamics were largely the same, but I was different within them, and the difference was enough to make the visit something I could be genuinely present for rather than something I managed my way through. My mother noticed. She did not say anything directly, but at some point during the visit, she looked at me in a way that I recognized as her reading me, her particular version of the attentiveness she had always brought to the family, and I thought I saw in that reading a kind of recognition, the acknowledgement of a change that she could not fully name, but that she could clearly feel. I looked back at her. We did not say anything. The dinner conversation continued around us. But something passed between us in that look that was more honest than most of what had ever been spoken in that house. And I held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters, for the rest of the visit and for a long time after. There is a moment that I want to start this final section with, not because it was the most significant moment of the year that followed the Tuesday conversation, but because it was the one that made everything else feel most coherent, the way a particular image will sometimes organize a whole period of experience into a shape you can actually see. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in late October, about 11 months after the Tuesday conversation with Ryan. I was at my parents' house for a weekend visit, the second visit of that particular year that had felt different in the way I described, more spacious, less managed. Ryan was not there this time. It was just me and my parents, the three of us, which had its own particular dynamic that was different from the dynamic when Ryan was present, both more intimate and in some ways more exposed. My father and I were in the backyard in the late afternoon light. He had been working on something in the garden, which he does on fall weekends, the particular focused quiet labor of someone who is most comfortable when there is a task that has a clear outcome. I had come outside with 2 cups of coffee, and I handed him one and sat on the steps of the back porch. He sat in the garden chair nearby, and we both looked at the yard for a while without saying anything. The silence between my father and me had always had a particular quality. Not hostile, not empty, more like a silence that both of us filled, individually and privately, with whatever we were not saying, so that the silence was full rather than absent, occupied with the unspoken in the specific way of 2 people who love each other and have never quite learned how to say so in the direct, unguarded way that might feel natural if the tools had been developed differently. I sat in that silence, and I let it be what it was. I did not try to fill it or to manage it or to assess its atmospheric quality and respond accordingly. I just sat in it and drank my coffee and looked at the yard in the late October light. At some point my father said, without preamble and without looking at me, "I think I've been hard to talk to." He said it the way he said most personal things, flatly, without inflection, as though the flatness was a way of delivering something significant without having to fully acknowledge how significant it was. I did not respond immediately. I let it land. Then I said sometimes, not to be difficult and not to wound him, just because it was true and because the work I had been doing had given me enough of something, enough steadiness or spaciousness or whatever the right word is, to say the true thing without softening it into something more comfortable than it was. He nodded once slowly, still looking at the yard. He said he knew. He said his father had been hard to talk to, and he had spent his whole life knowing it and not knowing how to be different, and that he was sorry that had landed on me and Ryan. I sat with that for a long time. It was not a comprehensive apology. It did not name the specific things or acknowledge the specific costs or enter into the full honest accounting of what the childhood's atmosphere had produced. It was partial and somewhat opaque in the way that all of his communication was partial and somewhat opaque, but it was something. It was the most direct acknowledgement of the transmission that I had ever heard from him, the recognition that what his father had given him he had passed on, and the regret for that passing. I said I know it wasn't intentional, and I meant it, and I said I turned out okay, which was also true, imprecise as it was as a summary of everything the past year had involved. He looked at me then briefly, the direct look that he rarely gave but that communicated when it came, the full weight of what he felt in a way that nothing he said ever quite managed, and then he looked back at the yard. We sat there for another 20 minutes, the 2 of us, drinking the coffee and not saying anything else. The light moved across the yard in the way of late afternoon in October, the low warm slant of it that makes everything look briefly more beautiful than it is, and I sat in it and let it be the thing it was, which was a partial reckoning between two people who loved each other and had never quite had the language for it, conducted in a backyard over coffee on a Sunday afternoon, 11 months after a Tuesday conversation that had changed what I was able to see. It was not a resolution. I want to be clear about that because I have been careful throughout this account to resist the narrative pull toward resolution, toward the satisfying conclusion that the difficulty led directly to a healed relationship and a transformed understanding. That is a story, and real life is not always a story in that sense. What I had sitting on those porch steps was a moment of genuine contact with my father, more direct than most of the moments we had had before, and that genuine contact mattered without being a solution. The relationship with my parents continued after that Sunday, as it continues now. The weekly calls, the visits, the ordinary ongoing life of a family that loves each other and that carries, beneath the love, the accumulated weight of all the things that were never quite said. I am in it differently than I was before the Tuesday conversation. Not visibly differently from the outside, I think, but from the inside the difference is real and it is mine, and it is not going away. I want to return to Ryan, because he has been present throughout this account, and because what I want to say about what the Tuesday conversation ultimately gave us, beyond the individual reckonings, is really about what it gave the two of us as brothers. We talk more now than we did before the Tuesday conversation, not more frequently, more honestly, which is a different kind of more. The conversations go further than they used to, into territory that we would previously have moved past quickly out of the mutual carefulness that characterized our relationship for most of our adult lives. We are not careful in the same way anymore. Or rather, we are careful differently, careful in the direction of honesty rather than in the direction of equilibrium, which means we sometimes sit in discomfort longer than we would have before, because we are both more willing now to stay with the uncomfortable thing rather than to smooth it over. He told me something in the spring, about 6 months after the Tuesday conversation, that I want to include here because it felt like the clearest articulation of what we had both been working through. He said that he thought the Tuesday conversation had been the first time in his adult life that he had talked to me rather than with me. He said that before it, all of our conversations, however warm and however genuine, had operated within a particular set of mutual agreements about what we were and were not going to address, agreements that neither of us had made explicitly but that had structured the conversations nonetheless. He said the Tuesday conversation had broken those agreements, and that the breaking, uncomfortable as it had been, had made him feel more like my brother than he had felt in years. Not more like a sibling in the biological sense, which we had always been, but more like someone who was genuinely in the same thing with me rather than someone who was walking alongside me at a friendly and carefully maintained distance. I told him I felt the same way, that the distance was something I had not quite named or consciously experienced before it changed, but that looking back I could see it had been there, the mutual carefulness operating as a kind of gap that both of us had maintained and neither of us had examined. The gap was smaller now. I do not think it will ever fully close, because some of it is structural, the product of the genuinely different experiences we had of the same childhood, and those different experiences will always make our relationship to the family different in ways that produce different perspectives. We will always be looking at the same thing from different angles. But we understand both angles now in a way we did not before, and that understanding has made the relationship between the angles closer, even as the angles themselves remain distinct. There is something I want to say about what the whole experience, from the Tuesday conversation through everything it required across the following year, has done to my understanding of memory and how it works in families. I had believed before the Tuesday conversation that the function of shared memory in a family was basically archival, that the people who had been present for the same events had, in their collective recollection, something approaching a complete record of those events, the individual memories supplementing and correcting each other like multiple witnesses to the same scene. The more people who remembered something, the more complete the record. What the Tuesday conversation revealed was that this is not how family memory actually works. Family memory is not archival, it is interpretive. Each person in the family system is not a witness to the family so much as a participant in it, and their position as a participant shapes what they observe and what they retain and what meaning they assign to what they retain. Ryan and I had been present for the same events and had emerged with memories that were not just differently detailed but differently oriented, pointing in different directions, drawing on different aspects of the shared experience, because different aspects had been relevant to our different positions within the family. This means that no single person's memory of a family is complete. Not mine, not Ryan's, not our mother's, not our father's. Each of us holds a portion of the truth of the family, shaped by where we stood within it, and the full picture, if such a thing exists, would require all four versions to be held simultaneously, with an honest acknowledgement that the four versions do not fully reconcile, and that the irreconcilability is itself part of the truth rather than an error to be resolved. I find that genuinely comforting in a way I did not expect to. It removes the pressure of having to be right about the family. My version of the childhood is real and accurate, and it is also partial. Ryan's version is real and accurate and also partial. Our parents' versions are real and accurate and also partial. Nobody has the whole thing and nobody needs to. What is required is not the complete picture, but the willingness to hold your own portion honestly and to receive other people's portions with the kind of respect that partial truths deserve. The therapy ended, in a natural and unforced way, in the autumn of the following year. Dr. Owens and I had a final session in which she asked me how I felt compared to how I had felt when I started, and I said I felt more like myself, which I meant in the specific and concrete sense that I had more access to whatever was actually there underneath the role, more spacious in the way I had described wanting to be. Not completely spacious. The monitoring still runs. I still read rooms and track atmospheric signals and adjust myself in response, probably always will to some degree. But I notice it happening now, and I have the choice of whether to act on it, which is something I did not have before. The noticing and the choice are the gains. They do not sound like much summarized that way. They are, in the lived experience of them, genuinely significant. My father and I had 2 more conversations in the year after the backyard Sunday that approached the territory of that conversation, neither as direct, but both real in the accumulated way of people making incremental progress towards something without ever quite namming the destination. He asked me once, in a way that seemed to take him some effort to get to, whether I was happy. Not what are you working on or how is everything, but whether I was actually happy. I said I was, mostly and genuinely, and he nodded in that particular way of his, and then said good in a way that communicated considerably more than the word itself. I counted it as progress. It was progress. My mother and I have gotten closer in the specific way that becoming more honest with someone makes you closer to them. The closeness of being seen more fully rather than the closeness of being carefully comfortable with each other. She has talked to me more openly, in the year since the first phone call after the Tuesday conversation, about her own interior life, about the years of the marriage and the family in ways she had never talked about them before. Not as complaints or as confessions, but as the ordinary candid reflections of a person who had been carrying her own version of the family's unspoken material for a long time, and was gradually learning, with someone she trusted, to let some of it be spoken. I hold those conversations with care. She is still my mother and she is still in the marriage, and she is still navigating her own relationship to the family system in her own way and at her own pace. What she shares with me is hers to share or not share as she chooses, and I receive it without agenda, the way I have been learning to receive most things, with attention, and without the urgency to do something with it immediately. Ryan and his girlfriend got engaged in the spring of this year. He called me first before anyone else, which felt right and which I told him. We talked for an hour about it, about what it meant to him, and what he was feeling and what he was thinking about marriage and family, and the particular question of what kind of family you build when the family you came from gave you something complicated to build from. He asked me what I thought, and I told him honestly, which was that I thought he was someone who had been doing genuine work on himself in the year since the Tuesday conversation, and that the work would go with him into the marriage, and that was the most useful thing anyone building a new family could bring to it. He said, "You sound like a therapist." I said I had been spending a lot of time with one. He laughed. We talked for another 30 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of this, the ordinary accumulated content of 2 brothers who talk regularly and know each other's lives. When we hung up, I sat for a few minutes in the quiet of my apartment and thought about the laundry room equivalent of our story, the origin point that had been the second week of our lives rather than the second week of college, the particular morning in whatever year it was when the world delivered a second child into a household that already had one, and the 2 of us began the long shared project of growing up in the same place at the same time. I thought about what it means to share that project with someone and then discover, decades later, that the sharing was more complicated than it had appeared, that you had each been inside your own version of the same years, and that the versions diverged in ways neither of you had known. I thought about how that discovery, which could have been a fracture, had instead become the thing that made the connection more real, the honesty of the divergence producing a closer understanding than the comfortable assumption of sameness had ever managed. The Tuesday conversation in November changed what I knew about my childhood. It changed what I knew about my brother. It changed what I knew about my family and about myself, and about the specific kind of person the childhood had been making me for 30 years without my full awareness. None of those changes were comfortable. All of them were, in the way that real things tend to be, worth what they cost. I am still in the process of understanding it. I think I will always be in the process of understanding it, because the work of knowing yourself is not a project with a completion date, but an ongoing practice of the same kind that attention to anything is an ongoing practice. You do not arrive at yourself and stop. You keep paying attention, and what you find keeps shifting as you do. Ryan and I are having dinner next month, just the 2 of us at his place, the kitchen table where the Tuesday conversation happened. We do not have anything specific to discuss. We are just brothers having dinner, which is the most ordinary thing in the world and which is, for reasons that this account has tried to explain, something that means more to me now than it would have meant before November of 2 years ago. I will bring the wine, he will cook. We will sit at the table and talk for longer than we planned to, into the late-night territory that produces honesty, and we will be in that kitchen, the fullest version of what we have always been to each other, which is the person who was there for all of it, now understanding what all of it actually was. That is enough. That is, honestly, more than enough. That is everything.